So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you into this morning's webinar where we're going to spend some time looking at the accounts payable module in our writer. We won't just be in the main our writer point of sale. We'll get into the accounts payable module. We're going to talk about configuration a little bit. We'll talk about inventory as well. So again, we're going to kind of jump around into a lot of different places as we go through this morning. And before we begin, again, I often get asked the question, well, why should I track accounts payable? Why don't I just hand my accountant or my bookkeeper all of the receipts from the day's purchases and they can handle making sure my vendors get paid? I'd really give you kind of three primary reasons why we're going to track accounts payable. First is going to be so that you have an electronic recording to know what you owe. I bought something from a vendor and I'm going to have to pay them for it at some point in time, whether we paid up front or it was on an open account, so I'd like to be able to track where that stuff went, meaning follow it through so I know exactly who I owe and for what. Second would be to make sure that I know what the parts that I've purchased have ended up somewhere, whether it's in my inventory, whether it went on an invoice as we were finalizing a transaction for a customer, whether we bought some shop supplies, but so that I have a better audit trail of all of those receipts that came in from a vendor and or that statement that shows my outstanding charges. I can follow those through and know where they went, making sure that they're being actually used in the shop environment. The last piece would be to make sure that our petty cash is being tracked accordingly. We took money out of the drawer to pay this vendor for a part or to pay the uniform or the landscaper or whomever it might be. I want to be able to keep track of exactly how much petty cash is getting outputted so that as we're counting down the drawer, we know exactly how much money we would expect to have on hand. Now, before we get into accounts payable per se, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the configurable settings that relate to how accounts payable behaves. We're looking at just my main our writer screen, and as I looked at this window here, I've got a transaction down at the bottom for Allison Swanson and her 2001 Dodge Durango. Inside of this window, we've decided that in order to fix what ails the vehicle, we're going to have to both remove and replace the starter, as well as remove and replace the power steering pressure switch. Inside of each of these parts, there's a box over here on the right-hand side that says invoice number, as well as there is a flag here that dictates whether or not this is a part that's coming out of my stock and or is a non-stock part, something we are buying on the outside. Right now, I've got my system configured so that it will not force me to go through any of the accounts payable processes in order to finalize this transaction. Notice, as I'm looking at my window, all the lines on her transaction are in black, meaning if I was to hit finalize right now, we could go ahead and finalize this transaction without having to go through the AP posting process. Again, as I look inside of the part itself, even though I'm buying this on the outside, flagged as a stock item, and we're not recording the vendor invoice for that piece. I'm going to close out of this transaction here, and again, we're going to start our conversation about accounts payable over in the configuration module. Starting with underneath File, I'm going to go down to General Options. When I click on General Options, I'm going to be using accounts payable. I want to make sure I'm going to ask my service advisors, my technicians, whomever will do the posting, I'm going to ask them to post things into accounts payable. I want to make it as easy as possible for them to go through that process. So I'm going to start by adding an icon to my top toolbar that says Post AP. I'm going to click on that box there where it says Post AP Invoice, and then I can define underneath whether they post in detail or post in summary. I'm going to have it set to post in detail, but we'll talk about the difference as we get over to accounts payable a little bit later on in this morning's presentation. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add that icon up there to the top toolbar, make it easy for them to get in and post the accounts payable transaction. So I'll save that change by clicking on OK. Second place we're going to go under configuration is down to repair order, and the very first option in my list says RO options. When I come into RO options, there's really three things that we're going to flag and or touch inside of this window here. The first one is make status adjustments for negative on hands. In my case, I've got it set to never. So where it says stock versus non-stock, I have the ability to modify that, and the system will not attempt to change that value based upon my current stocking status. I'm going to change that. My options are never, prompt, or always. My recommendation would be that if you want everything to go through accounts payable, that you set this to always. If you set it to prompt, then if the system does an assessment of the current stocking level of a part and finds it to be deficient, meaning I'm going to sell 4 tires and only have 2 on my shelf, then it's going to ask the end user it will give them a message that says, would you like to switch this to non-stock? If I give the end user an option, they may answer yes, they may answer no. I don't have 100% assurance that they're going to answer that question correctly in every case. In our case, we're going to change that from never to always, and what we'll find is that as we proceed through a transaction, the system will look to see if we have sufficient quantity of a part in order to handle what's being sold as part of that transaction, and if we don't, it's going to flag it as a non-stock item, which based upon subsequent changes we're here going to make will force us to go through the process of posting an accounts payable transaction. We could also go in and do an inventory adjustment or receive a purchase order, but there needs to be something done in order to make sure that that on-hand quantity is brought up and or sufficient in order to handle what's being sold as part of that transaction. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to uncheck a couple of boxes. This one here that says edit INV number on add parts and edit INV number on add labor. I'll uncheck both of those boxes and I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. So to see the changes that we've made to this point take effect in our writer, we will have to close the program and open it back up again. Again, we're changing behavioral items as far as our writer is concerned, so those will get changed only when we close and reopen the program. As it launches again, first thing we see is in the upper right-hand corner, I now have an icon there that says Post AP. Again, we turned that on in General Options. Back into Allison Swanson's transaction, if I looked at that remanufactured starter, what you'll notice is right now it says it's a stocking item. However, I no longer have an option to change that. If I clicked on OK, we've got that part on the ticket. I'm going to go ahead and remove it, and I'm going to add it back on. So in my case, we're going to do what's called a smart job, but it doesn't matter whether we added it through a catalog search, through just the part window. But now if I go in and do my starting and charging, and I go ahead and say we're going to do that starter, remove, and replace, as I work my way through that transaction and I find that starter available from my local Napa store, once I select and add that onto the ticket, once I click on Next and then hit Post and Exit, it brings it over onto my transaction. As I look at it, it's by default flagged as non-stock. So again, the change that we've made with that prompt always and or never says as I add a part to a transaction, look into my local inventory. If the on-hand quantity isn't sufficient, meaning meet or exceed, and or if it's not a known part in my master inventory, then I'm going to force you to enter an accounts payable transaction. Now, not quite so much just yet. Notice on the right-hand side, that little button there that says invoice number now says post to AP. So I cannot fill in my invoice number. However, it's not lit up in red. So were I to assign a technician to this job and assign him to all of the items on this transaction, I could now finalize this transaction without entering in my accounts payable piece. The next place we want to go, and I'm going to go back into configuration, is underneath my configuration header, down to repair order, and then over to required entries. In the required entries window, in this case, we're going to change the setting here where it says warn if invoice number blank for non-stock sale. I'm going to set that to require. So I'm going to set it to require, and now what it says is, well, not only can you not type something into that box, however, you have to, for anything that's a non-stock item, make sure that there is a value in that box before you finalize the transaction. So in essence, we're forcing them to go through the accounts payable process for any part that they're just purchasing to go directly onto a transaction. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to flag that as warn if invoice number blank for non-stock sale. I'll click on OK. One last place before I go back to our writer and look and see what some of the changes we've made are going to impact. Under configuration, down to parts, and then over to almost the very bottom where it says PO, transfer, and other parts options. In here, there are also settings that are going to impact the way that accounts payable plays. For example, disable editing PO in AP. PO standing for purchase order, AP standing for accounts payable. We'll see this behavior shortly as we go to post an AP transaction. The system is going to take whatever we've entered as, whichever invoice we're posting the AP to as the purchase order number, so that we can go ahead and make sure we're tracking where those parts are actually being installed on what transaction. Create AP transaction when posting a purchase order. So as we're creating or posting our purchase order, the system will automatically make us post that AP transaction. Pre-select AP payment type. Each time we go to post an AP transaction, the majority of my transactions are charged to an open account I have with a vendor. So that will be my default payment type, would be a charge. We'll adjust as is necessary. Then down here where it says default core account, again it says cores, which would be seemingly redundant. But as we're looking at something like a a detail of expenses by account report, every time we post a part with a core, it's going to enter or create a line item entry in my core account so I can see through accounts payable what my potential outstanding core balance might be. So again, the last place in configuration, underneath the configuration header down to parts, and then PO transfer and other parts options. We did make, again, a behavioral change as far as requiring that we edit or we enter that invoice number before we finalize a transaction. So in order to see that change take effect, I will again have to close our writer and reopen. Once it comes back up, I've got Allison down there at the bottom where you'll notice both of my items now lit up in red. And that's because as I'm looking at, for example, that starter, it says that I have to post to the accounts payable module before I can finalize this transaction. It's a non-stock item, and so therefore we've got to post our AP transaction. Now the button there that says Post to AP, if I wanted to post this part, I could click on Post to AP directly from in there, and it opens my Post Accounts Payable Invoice window. I will tell you, it does not matter whether I click that icon from inside of the part record and I click that there, and or I go to Post AP at the top of the screen. Either one will do the exact same thing. In the typical course of the day, I'm not often looking at the particular transaction when a parts vendor shows up to deliver, in this case, my starter and my power steering pressure switch. So they walk through the door, they hand me the parts as well as they give me my copy of the invoice, and I come up here to Post AP. When I go to Post Accounts Payable, in this case, my vendor was Napa. So I'm going to hit the N key on my keyboard. I could also use my up and down arrows and or drop the window down to scroll through the list. But I'll first identify the supplier. The invoice date should be the day that I was billed for it from the vendor. If I bought it on Monday and now on Friday is when I'm actually going to receive it, we want to set it back to Monday, making sure that our record matches what the vendor says as far as when we were actually billed for that purchase. On that paperwork from the vendor, I ought to have an invoice number, so we'll enter that here. This is the vendor's invoice number. If I wanted to call them up and have them research it, this would be the invoice number I would provide. Down and to the right, charge is my pre-selected payment type, so all I'll do is hit Next in the lower right-hand corner. So we click on Next, and there are three options as far as where we go from here. In the lower left-hand corner, we've got Repair Order, Inventory, and Cost Account. Now we'll go through each as we go through this morning's presentation, but in this first scenario I bought some parts, both a starter and a power steering pressure switch for Allison Swanson's 01 Dodge Durango. So I'm going to click on the Repair Order icon in the lower left-hand corner. Brings up my list of work-in-progress transactions. So again, were we to compare this to this list here, that's what gets displayed. In theory, the work in progress is intended to indicate the jobs that have been sold. So in this case, it's only showing me my work in progress because we wouldn't have bought a part if we hadn't yet sold the job. So I'll select Allison from my list. I'll click on Next, and it shows me that there are two parts on this transaction that have not yet had an AP transaction posted against them. So if I had 10 parts on there and I was only buying 2 on the outside, I would see all 10. If I had 10 parts on there, I was buying 2 on the outside, and 1 had already been posted, then I'd only see 9. So again, that's my filter in this window has it been posted into accounts payable to this point or not? In our case, we'll start with the pressure switch. That is an existing part on the transaction in the lower right-hand corner. There is both new part and or existing part. We ordered a PS313. If they sent me a replacement part, it wasn't the PS313, I might use the new part icon to build that new part on this transaction. Or if they sent me the part that I ordered, I'm going to flag that as an existing part. When I do existing part, I'll want to verify my cost and my core. In this case, my pressure switch does not have a core charge associated, but I'm going to receive it in at $23.75. $0.78, and I'll click on OK. They also brought me the starter at the same time, so again, highlighted by default, seeing as it's the only part left. I hit existing part in the lower right-hand corner. I'll verify my cost, and I will verify the core, and that the core is being received with sale, meaning we're not charging the consumer. We're going to put this into my dirty core bank so we can manage and track that $31 heading back to the vendor. I'll click on OK in the lower right-hand corner. So now we've got our part cost as well as our core. If I needed to change anything at this point, well, we're kind of at a point of no return, meaning I would have to just hit cancel. I would have to just close out of this window here or post it and go back in and edit it after the fact through the accounts payable module. I'll hit post in the lower right-hand corner, and it asks me a question. It says, if you have not yet printed an invoice, you may do so now. Do you want to print an invoice? I'm going to answer yes to that question. Go ahead and print that to the screen. The concept of the AP detail receipt is that we just posted an outstanding balance into our account for Napa. Do I want to know the detail of what made up that $120.75 and $31.48 in cores? And or if I looked in accounts payable, we keep the summary as far as what was actually received and or purchased. Also, if we don't have any other visible means of displaying that we've posted an accounts payable transaction, for example, a lot of stores, they'll take that invoice from Napa, they'll stamp it, or they'll write on it that it was received this time, this date, and by whom. So as I look at each outstanding vendor invoice, I should be able to tell relatively quickly whether it has or has not been posted into accounts payable. If I don't have any other means of making that identification, then we'll print this out and we'll staple it to every vendor invoice. And into the bin with our rest of our paperwork it goes. As I'm looking through my vendor invoices, every one of them should have this piece of paper stapled to it as my clear visual indicator that we've got our accounts payable transaction posted. My bookkeeper is trying to research, well, we had a discrepancy between what I said we owed Napa and what Napa says we owe, and I want to see, well, what did we put in our writer versus what came from the vendor. I've now got both of those pieces of paper, one next to another. So from researching discrepancies, printing and or stapling to this will also be helpful in that area as well. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close out of my printed report. So we've posted our accounts payable transaction. If I was to go back into Allison Swanson and look at either one of the parts that are on there, you'll notice now I've got my invoice number set in that box there. My part number, my cost, my quantity, my vendor are all now locked in because we've now posted that into accounts payable. If we had made a mistake and we needed to undo, well, we'd start out by flagging this as returned, add the part again and repost. And when we get over into accounts payable, we'll see where we can go ahead and edit the invoice. I can't go back and change this because this is going to impact accounting. So therefore, we have to keep an audit trail of any changes that get made from this point forward. So we've put our parts on there, one with the core, one without the core. We've posted our accounts payable transaction. We're going to go ahead and get out of Allison, at least for the time being. So we went ahead and we posted to a repair order. We had three options as we were going through the post AP process. The second piece after we get through a repair order is to go ahead and post something into inventory. If we go into a post accounts payable, and again, we'll keep picking on Napa just so that we get some transactional information as we go to run reports. But we did call up Napa and we had them send us down some oil filters. We noticed we were light, or maybe our vendor showed up to replenish our stock. But in this case, again, on the vendor invoice, there was an invoice number. We'll record that. We do still have an open account with Napa for charging these items. And if we click on next in the lower left-hand corner, as opposed to sending it to a repair order, in this case, we're going to go into inventory. So I'm just going to type in my part number. After I typed it in, I hit the enter key on the keyboard. It's this oil filter that we've received, and all I have to tell it is here's how many that we have received into the system. Click on OK in the lower right-hand corner. And if I went back and said, well, now how about the next part number that's on that order? And I'll just continue on. In this case, we've received 3 of those, and then I'll click on OK. So I just keep entering in part number, quantity received, verifying my cost each time until we're done, and then at that point I'll hit post in the lower right-hand corner. Wants to now know what purchase order did I give to Napa for having ordered those parts. So if I did give them a purchase order number, we'll enter that into our window there and click on OK. Same question about that vendor invoice number. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and I could print that vendor invoice number. It asks, would you like to print it? I won't go through the exercise of printing it to the screen and closing it again. The same concept of having some sort of visual cue that a vendor invoice has been posted into accounts payable. My last option would be to post to a cost account. We're going to go up to post accounts payable, and when we do, we're going to go back, and in this case, you know what, we had called up Napa and we needed some shop towels or some hand soap or something that's never going to go onto a customer's vehicle. It shouldn't be part of my inventory. But our invoice number when it showed up from Napa was 123456. We do still have that open account. I'll click on next in the lower right hand corner. In this case, it's going to go to a cost account. When I go into my cost account, it brings me up a separate window for posting to a cost account. The dollar amount was $17.85, and it goes into shop supplies by default. I'll hit post in the lower right hand corner. Same question about printing that document. I've got an invoice from Napa. I want to have something that gives me a visual idea that it's been posted, but I'll save ourselves the step of going through and printing and then going ahead and closing. Post in the lower right hand corner, and again, in this case, do we give Napa a PO number for this purchase? And if we did, we'll enter that value in there. So we've now posted to a cost account as well. Now beyond that, we're going to go back up to post AP for a second because, you know what, we took some money out of the drawer. Had to give my technician some money for gas because he drove a customer home or went and picked up a part. And or I decided to order food for the guys because we had a good week, and so I want to just thank and reward them for their hard work. As I come into a post accounts payable invoice, if I scroll through my list here, again, we picked on Napa, and we'll find my standard supplier names like CarQuest and O'Reilly and Advance and AutoZone in my list. In this list here, we'll also find that I've entered in some generic items. For example, I've got an option there for food for employees. One day I bought pizza, so we went to Pizza Hut. The next day I bought tacos from Taco Bell, and then the next time we ordered food, I picked up burgers from McDonald's. Well, I don't have or an account with any of those vendors, but I want to keep track of the fact that this transaction or this purchase was made, especially since it's going to impact the amount of petty cash in my drawer. So we'll just select food for employees as a general account for any of those types of transactions. And in this case, where it says invoice number, well, you know what, when I went to Pizza Hut and I bought pizza, they didn't give me an invoice number. They gave me a receipt, which I'll want to make sure I keep. However, no invoice number on there. So in my case, I'm going to use this as a notation field. This will be the vendor that we purchased it from, just so that if I'm ever going back to look and see, then I should know that this particular transaction is going to come from Pizza Hut. In the lower right-hand corner, where it says payment type, we took cash out of the drawer. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select petty cash as my payment type. You'll notice two other payment types we haven't discussed, either if I was going to write a check and or if I had a shop credit card that I kept at the shop for purposes of buying things when I didn't have an open account. So I'll go to petty cash in the lower right-hand corner. I'll click on next. And the same concept as before. In this case, it's going to go to a cost account. When I do food for employees, the account it goes into by default is going to be a shop expense. All I need to do is define exactly how much we had spent we took out of the drawer in terms of petty cash. Click on post. It again affords me an opportunity to print that document showing that I've posted this into accounts payable. Again, I'll skip the step, and then when I hit post in the lower right-hand corner, as I come in, it says, I'd like you to enter in a purchase order number. Well, much like there was no receipt number for Pizza Hut, there was also no invoice number from Pizza Hut in this case. I also didn't give them a PO number, but in my case, again, we'll use this for notation purposes. I'm the one that gave the approval to actually spend this money, so I'll put that in as the PO number. If there's ever a question somewhere down the road as to, well, who decided that was acceptable, in theory, it's my fault. I'm sorry, it was my decision. You can come in and you can ask me about having creating that outstanding petty cash transaction. Now, a couple other things before we leave the point of sale and we go over into accounts payable. That is, we have posting accounts payable for parts, but then there's also the ability to post accounts payable for labor. If I go in and look at Allison Swanson's transaction again, I've got, for example, that starter remove and replace, which as I'm looking at it, to the lower left-hand corner, there's a box there that says post AP, at current, grayed out. I don't have the ability to do that and or to post accounts payable transaction. If I went and I added another job onto this ticket, had a bad starter, maybe it had to get towed in to the shop, and so we want to make sure we're charging the customer for the tow, even though it's handled through a third-party towing company. So I'm going to go down to where we've got a category for sublet/outside services. In that list, I have a job pre-set up for towing. I'm going to select that towing job, and what you'll notice is the Post AP button immediately becomes available. The trick, and or really what drives that behind the scenes, is this checkbox that says sublet. If that sublet box is unchecked, then the system says, well, you're not going to post an accounts payable transaction because you're saying that this wasn't performed by a third-party company. When that box is checked, then it says, well, I'll allow you now to post an accounts payable transaction for this. So in our case, we've got our technician, which for a towing job, I'm just going to assign it to my generic shop technician, and the amount that we're charging the consumer is going to be $65 for having towed that in. Quite honestly, the technician is important because it's going to use that to try to calculate out a cost of labor. The charge is just what we're going to charge the consumer. The most important piece as we go to post our accounts payable transaction is this value here. How much are we actually going to pay to my towing company in order for having had that vehicle towed in? So in our case, we're going to say that it's $50. When I click on Post AP in the lower left-hand corner, again, you'll notice the dollar amount grayed out. The payment type, we're going to adjust to petty cash, having taken that out of the drawer, and then my vendor that we're working from is going to be Carter's Towing. I'll ask you to watch as we go through. I'm going to change my vendor from 1-800-RADIATOR, which by default, the first one on my list, to Carter's Towing. You'll watch the account down here at the bottom, and what you're going to notice is as I select Carter's Towing, it flips that and says, well, I know any expenses that are added to Carter's Towing as a vendor should by default be added to the expense account towing. So for tracking purposes, for total amount spent purposes, it's following the vendor and or the supplier. I'm going to actually jump into the supplier configuration window for just a moment. I'm going to hit this plus key to the right. And for those of you that aren't familiar, anytime you see a plus key to the right of a drop-down box, it's actually a shortcut to the configuration window for that particular drop-down. So if I wanted to look at, modify, add to my supplier list, I hit that plus key, and if I go down to Carter's Towing, what you'll notice over here on the right-hand side, there is a default accounting code, and in that is my list of expense items or expense accounts. We're going to see where we modify those expense accounts here shortly, but again, I can assign an account to a supplier by default. If I don't assign an account to a supplier, then by default it will go into inventory, which in my case is assigned a numeric value of 1400, 1401. But if we assign a default account to a supplier, then as soon as we select it, then the system will say we're going to assign that to that particular vendor account. I'm going to hit cancel and close back out of there. Change my supplier down again. We'll find Carter's Towing in the list, and then $50 was the appropriate amount. They didn't actually have an invoice number, but they did have a numbered pad of paper that they ripped one off and gave it to us as my receipt for having paid them for that tow. And once I've filled in the information that's relevant, supplier, invoice, payment type, I'll hit post in the lower right-hand corner. Same hard copy documentation that will allow us to see that we did post this into accounts payable. And in our case, again, we'll save the steps of going through printing it to the screen. Notice now that we've posted our accounts payable, the only thing we could change would be to add additional verbiage to the description for this particular piece. I'll click on OK, and now the towing charge listed on the transaction for Allison Swanson, along with the rest of my other transactions. One last piece before we get into accounts payable, and that's as it relates to inventory. We went through and we did post AP, and then we went through when we did post AP, we posted it to inventory. Over in inventory, there's an option there that says post receipts. I'm going to bring up that window, and this window should look familiar. It's the exact same window that we got to when we went through our post accounts payable or post AP icon. The difference is if you do it in inventory, it will allow me to go through the exact same process and click OK to adjust my on hand. However, we never create the AP entry. So my recommendation is if you are using accounts payable, We don't use post receipts in inventory. Anytime we want to execute that particular function, we do so through the post AP icon in the main ROWriter module and or through the accounts payable module directly. Again, that will make sure that we're creating that AP transaction as opposed to just adjusting my on-hand inventory. I'm going to close out of Allison Swanson and go over on the left-hand side actually into the accounts payable module, which has only taken us a half an hour into today's conversation to get into the module the topic is built around. But if we come in here and talk about the different icons that are available there, starting left to right, beginning with the one that says Post Invoice. You'll notice under Post Invoice you get a submenu to either post by summary or post by detail. We've actually done both through the course of our time this morning. If I click Post Invoice by detail, that's what the system is doing. Is it's, as we're hitting Post AP, is it's just opening this window here. So the icon in our writer that says Post AP is literally just a shortcut to Post Invoice by either detail or summary based upon, again, in our case, how we've got it configured. If you do Post Invoice by detail, again, we get to track. Did it go to inventory? Did it go to a repair order? Did it go to a cost account? So we get that detail. If we did it by summary, then again, if I looked at it, the only thing summary says is we owe somebody money. I bought something from Napa for $100, but we don't get the detail of what transaction it went to. Did it go into inventory? What was it actually for? Again, my advice would be use Post Invoice by detail and use it universally for all transaction types. Again, you should recognize this window as we posted our labor to a cost account, then it came into this window here. As we posted our AP transactions for both my shop towels from Napa and also the pizza that we purchased also came into this window here. So we are doing post invoices by summary, but we're doing it by adding in the detail first of exactly who and why as we go along. So again, post invoice by detail, and then again, if we add the icon into the main ROWriter window, then there's really not a necessity for them to ever come into accounts payable. They just do that directly through the link at the top of our writer. To the right of that, we've got an option to pay an invoice. In this case, if I'm going to select my supplier. Now, I don't know many shops that pay their invoices directly through our writer. Most shops will vet that information through their accounting package, use that as the barometer of what they actually are outstanding to a particular vendor. But if I wanted to, I could keep this clean and say, well, we paid everything through the 1st of April, the last time that we sent a check to Napa. So if I say we're going to pay the invoices to, and I'll hit pay to date, lower left-hand corner, it says, well, that means that we would have paid them $3,300 and change in order to clear up all of those outstanding transactions. So if I wanted to come in here and have my outstanding balance in our writer match my true outstanding balance, we'd come in here, and again, I'll flag it as pay to date. In the lower right-hand corner, as I click on post, it's going to tell me that we've now posted that in, and if I was to go back and look at pay invoice again for the same exact vendor, you'll notice my balance much less significant based upon having told the system that I have paid and or paid up through the specific date. So again, this would just be to keep your vendor balances in our writer clean. If you really wanted to, if you had a check printer, you could have the system print a check directly from inside of our writer, and or in a lot of cases we'd use what's called a stub, and the stub would just tell me that these were the transactions that were being handled and or paid as part of this payment that we're posting. As we move over, the edit invoice would be if I wanted to come back in here, and for example, if I said, well, let's look at all of the invoices from Napa that were paid today. In our case, we've got either an open charge or a paid invoice, and in this case, it's saying, well, these are the outstanding invoices that we've posted from Napa. Here's my starter, there's my core, there's my parts that we've posted to our inventory, and there's the parts that we posted, or at least the expense that we posted to a cost account. If I was going to go in and change one of these here, so this wasn't actually 120.75, it was 125.75, this will not reach back over to the transaction for Allison Swanson and adjust the amount there. They are not tied together. So if I needed to change that, I would have to flag it as having been returned. If you look at it, we posted a starter for $95 and we posted a power steering pressure switch for $25. Didn't record that we posted two individual transactions. It recorded we posted one summary total. So again, if there was an issue and we wanted to change what it says on the actual transaction, we want to flag it as returned and re-add the ticket or re-add the part onto the transaction so we can correct as we go through. If I just wanted to change the dollar amount so that my outstanding AP was accurate, I could do that in here. Once I've done that, I'll need to click on Post so that the system will then record that I've made the adjustment to the dollar amount. I can also make one go away, meaning if I wanted to, I could come in here and say, you know what, that transaction just wasn't right. It wasn't even Napa we bought that from, it was CarQuest. So I'll go ahead and I'll remove that, in this case, expense item that we had added. Another link to the configuration window for suppliers out there to the right, same exact place we were as we talked about Carter's Towing. Again, it's just another way to get to that exact same window through the program. As we move over, our general accounts is where we would edit our list of either expense accounts. So as I looked at, for example, my towing account, well, there is my list of accounts that we've got in there. If we're using some of the integrations to accounting packages, we may or may not be putting in our account number there on the right-hand side, but this controls my list of different expense items. If you look at this window a bit different than some of the others, I can actually add to it by coming down here, just clicking in the very last box that's down there at the bottom and typing in whatever I'd like to have in there. And then once I click Done, if I came back in here in that expense accounts window, well, now I see that added in based upon it having been in the very last line item. So we just look for that open item at the very bottom, type in that box there. If I'd like to make something go away, all I have to do is click on the gray button on the left-hand side, hit the delete key on the keyboard, and that will then remove it from my list of expense items. So again, we can adjust that list of expense items, as well as we can actually have, in addition to charge, petty cash, and check, up to 9 additional listed payment types. Now they're called shop cards, but certainly if I had other means of payment that were making to vendors that I wanted to keep track of, I could just add in the description of what it might be. Maybe I've got more than one credit card on file, so I want to have an Amex and I want to have a Discover. And or again, maybe I've got an outstanding credit with a vendor that I want to make sure is getting applied, but I want to record it. So I add that in as a payment type. This is just after we get beyond charge, petty cash, and check, which are the 3 payment types listed by default. Where do we go from there? What other additional options? And if I don't have any others, I don't even have a credit card that we're using, that we either have to pay petty cash, put it on an open account, or write them a check, then I wouldn't have anything at all configured in this window here. My drop-down box would just have the 3 that are hard-coded by default. Last piece that we've got in accounts payable is this icon over here that says reports. I'm going to pick up the reports window. We get in there, there's about 7 or 8 different reports specifically relevant or related to accounts payable. We won't go through each one individually. I'm going to give you the same encouragement that I've done with other modules if you've watched around, and that is if you go up to the Help menu, and especially with version 1.31, the most current the current release version, and we've built this site that's called docs.ourwriter.com, that in our case, as we open up from the accounts payable module, it'll go right out to accounts payable for us. And if I was going to go through and look to see, what I'll see down towards the bottom is, well, here is the different reports. If I wanted to see what each report gave me as far as information was concerned, I just select and it will show me a sample of the report, along with give me detailed descriptions about what each field means where applicable. So again, I would say if you haven't ever before, in 131, if you click on Help, it'll take you right to the site, or you could just go to docs.ourwriter.com to go ahead and log into the exact same page. So if you're on a version prior to 131, just go to docs.ourwriter.com. No username, no password. The information is just out there for all to see. But you can go ahead and you can log in and see any of those accounts payable reports. In our case, there's just a couple that I want to take a look at. For example, a detail of expenses by account or detail expenses by supplier are probably the 2 most commonly used reports in accounts payable. Starting with, I want to know exactly how much did I spend in a particular account. Maybe it's towing in this case. And if I was to go in and hit print, again, I've got my date range defined, and I'll print it for every account. And as I bring that information up on the screen, what we'll see is, as it gives me my report, is for inventory, which is 1400, 1401, this is my outstanding balance. For my core account, $31.48. Towing, and again, in this case, it's listing the account number that I've assigned. If I'm not using the integrations, I would likely just have the alpha description. So again, it might say towing and then towing as I did my configuration. My detailed expenses by supplier report, if I went and printed that one, again, which supplier would we like to print it for? In our case, we'll print it for all of them. And in this case, we just have a handful of transactions we posted through the day. As I come into this one here, it tells me by supplier exactly how much we've spent. One other piece as far as this is concerned, we talked about being able to keep track of how much petty cash was spent. This column here where it says cash tells me that we've taken $71.17 out of the drawer to this point as part of today's transactions. Next, in the upper right-hand corner, a couple last reports. Down there at the bottom, there's an account paid by credit card. So if I've got that American Express that I keep on file and I want to see, well, time to pay the American Express bill, how much do we actually charge and to whom? And I should be able to see that with my account paid by credit card. And last but not least, if anybody deleted a transaction, as we did when we went into Napa and that expense item for $17 and change, I'd be able to see when those were deleted as well. So again, about 8 or 9 different reports in accounts payable, the detail of expenses by either account or supplier, if I'm using a shop credit card, and or if I'm giving somebody the option to go in and remove, would probably be the ones that we would use with the highest degree of frequency.